So let's talk about which armies are looking strongest and weakest in current 9th edition Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. In today's video I thought we'd revisit the 40k army tier list, just because so many factions have had so many changes in recent months. A bunch of new codexes have just dropped, there's new points costs, and a bunch of updated mission rules. With that in mind, I thought I'd just talk through my rough estimation of how strong the factions in Warhammer are right now, arranging them into 4 different tiers, starting with tier 4 at the weakest and tier 1 at the strongest. In this video we'll talk through each of the factions in turn, talking over a little about their strengths and weaknesses and why I've chosen to rank them where I have. As always, these tier lists are a little bit arbitrary. Good players who know the faction well will always do a little bit better with them than otherwise, and some of the factions are really quite variable. Some of them have some niche strong lists that can really punch far above the weight of the rest of the faction, so they could certainly rank differently at a competitive and casual level. I generally take this as a bit of a rough rule of thumb, and if you feel that I've ranked any armies too high or too low, I look forward to hearing about it down in the comments and tell me why. In any case, let's jump straight into it and start with tier 4. So in tier 4 I've chosen to rank 3 armies, and I'm afraid I'd currently rate these as some of the weakest in Warhammer 40k right now. Currently I've chosen to rank Craftworlds here, Chaos Space Marines and the Astra Militarum, all armies that I consider a bit more of a challenge to win tournaments and things with at the moment. First up, let's start with the Craftworlds, who to be honest I think is almost a little bit redundant to cover here, as we know that they're going to be getting a codex in the very near future. We know that both Harlequins and Inari are going to be rolled into this, so I'm afraid I haven't covered them on this list as they're so soon going to be rolled in. Currently I think I'd rank Harlequins as tier 3 and Inari as tier 4 right now. In any case, the Craftworlds book and their supplements certainly do have their strengths. Their psychic phase is still incredibly powerful, stacking multiple debuffs on units like Doom and Jinx, quickening their troops around the board, and protecting their own units with Fortune. They're pretty mobile, being fast moving Eldar, and they've got some of the stronger custom Craftworld traits out of the various different custom abilities. Expert Crafters is a brilliant damage boost, and can be accompanied with a trait of your choice. However, Craftworlds really have been struggling throughout basically all of 9th edition. Their datasheets are a bit overcosted, they can't quite bring enough firepower for just how fragile they are. A lot of their codex support choices, such as Warlord traits and relics, are just really underwhelming, and they don't really have a lot of tough, durable units to hold down midfield objectives, which is pretty much a must in 9th edition. Still, I'm afraid a lot of this is going to be completely redundant in a little bit of time when the Codex Eldari does release. Based on the news and rumours that we've heard so far, I'd be very surprised if it isn't absolute top tier. There'll be a reimagining every single unit, all the weapons, traits, and the various army-wide special rules, and it looks like their psychic's going to be just as powerful as ever. Next up we have Chaos Space Marines, certainly another faction that's been struggling for a long time. Chaos players have been looking forward to their new codex all the way since the start of the edition, and while they still have a lot of powerful options to include, they're far more of a challenge to win with than many other factions. Perhaps some of their biggest draws at the moment are stacking character and stratagem buffs to make one unit just incredibly shooty or fighty. There really are a few different ways that you can build a competitive Chaos army, either building around Iron Warrior vehicles, Emperor's Children melee, or Word Bearers possessed synergy. Or if you do take Black Legion, the main draw is Abaddon himself, a ridiculously strong datasheet, amazing buffs and fighting, though it does kind of feel that he's carrying the entirety of his legion on his back. They have had a couple of helpful changes recently, including a points drop to the standard Chaos Marine profile, just being 12 points, and the buff to the Death to the False Emperor, meaning that you get exploding 6s against everyone in melee. Again, despite really quite a lot of good things going for them, they do have kind of overcosted datasheets, and it has been quite frustrating for Chaos players waiting for their 9th edition decks with obvious buffs like the second wound on their Space Marines, unique secondaries, and a lot of changes that have basically been already confirmed from the Thousand Suns and Death Guard dexes that will be really nice for standard Chaos players to get a hold of. Fingers crossed their codex will be coming sometime soon. Now we've had a few Chaos releases in the Eldritch Omens box. It seems almost guaranteed to be fairly close now, though we still don't know the exact order that those last few books are going to be dropping. Finally, for the bottom tier we have the Astra Militarum, and the Guard are also having a very rough time of it in 9th edition. A lot of units that just don't really do all that much damage, and with all the powerful things that cut through standard guardsmen and vehicles like butter, their durability and numbers just doesn't really seem to be enough to save them at the moment. I'd argue that the best thing going for the Guard at the moment are the 2+ save Lehman Russes, particularly with Demolisher Cannons. They're one of the most dangerous units in the Codex, Pretty nice that they're now tougher than ever, and the standard Ross getting a points drop makes it a lot more competitive against the tank commander. Otherwise, the Manticores are still decent even at their new slightly higher points cost with full payload, and move plus loads of Auspex bodies is generally good for 9th edition missions, while you still do have enough troops to put on the objectives. Scion Squad's pretty handy to have around as well. 5-man troops perform particularly well in the new missions, and can deliver a little bit of pinpoint damage too. Again though, in a common theme with the other two in the bottom tier, they really do need a 9th edition codex. For competitive lists you can write off really quite a lot of options within the Guard codex. Their stratagems aren't particularly good, the Cadian supplement didn't do a whole load for them, and aside from a few support options they're a bit limited in damage dealing, they don't really do psychic or melee. They certainly have their strengths, but they're one of the more challenging armies to win with at the moment. Moving on, we come to tier 3. I'd rank all these armies a bit weaker than average, but with a good list played well, can certainly threaten some of the top spots at events, though again certainly a lot more of a challenge than some of the armies higher up the list I think. Here I've chosen to rank Death Guard, Imperial and Chaos Knights, Chaos Demons, and some of the Space Marine chapters that have a little bit less going for them. First up for the Death Guard, they're an army that I'd probably rank towards the top of this tier, or maybe bottom tier too. When their codex first came out, they were incredibly solid, arguably the strongest faction in the entire game, but then they've been rapidly upgunned by a lot of the other later releases, and just when they were looking like quite a nice mid-tier army that's got some things going for it, they've just eaten a whole raft of nerfs some chapter approved, things that they really didn't need, points bumps to things like the Terminators and Poxwalkers. It's still far from all bad though, the Plague Burst Crawler got a massive points drop, and now a trio of these I think is pretty much an auto-include in just about any Death Guard list that you can take them. Otherwise they do remain generally tough still between disgustingly resilience and plenty of good saves and high toughness. The Tallyman's an excellent support character with that Tollkeeper relic, and the Foul Blight spawns Plague Sprayer and Fight's Last Aura is still an awesome include even at his higher price. They've got a very helpful secondary in Spread the Sickness, and decent army-wide rules including Contagions of Nurgle and Disgustingly Resilient. I think it was kind of unfortunate though that a lot of their key units went up by fairly reasonable amounts. With Poxwalkers and Terminators going up, it really does make the core of the army feel weaker, and perhaps push the army a lot more towards Demon Engine lists, maybe supported by something like Epidemius. They are generally slow and maybe don't have quite as much damage output as some other factions, being a lot more about a slow war of attrition. Overall, I still don't really think that they're bad, but I really didn't like their chapter approved changes very much. Made an otherwise fairly balanced army into one that's not going to compete quite as well against some of the other powerful options out there. Next up we come to Imperial and Chaos Knights, which I'd kind of argue have broadly cosmetic differences aside from the ally options they have, so I'll cover them together here. I'd say that Knights have a very good amount of raw power going for them. They're basically forced to have every single unit in their army be a threatening vehicle model, which means that there's very little points wasted, and a lot of armies just really aren't put together for taking quite so many wounds of vehicle off the board. Their objective securing rules in the new update really did help the faction a lot, I thought. Objective secured armigers counting as 5 models are just really powerful indeed when they're just pinging onto midfield objectives and stealing them from the enemy, and without that I would have been much more tempted to put them down in tier 4, as up to that change they really struggled to win the objective game in any meaningful way. However, Knights certainly have their issues in 9th, arguably their 2 best ones, the Armiger Moirax and Questor Megara, were both nerfed in the chapter approved, not by enormous amounts, but it kind of stings when they were some of the best options that they had. Dense terrain boards in 9th have always been a big disadvantage for them. Super heavies being able to be shot but not shoot back is not great, and anything that blocks movement is really not ideal for bit vehicles with big bases. While they're now kind of strong in the primaries, they might well struggle for secondaries, plus there's Bring It Down as quite an easy one that you can take against Knights, and they're both still waiting for their 9th edition codexes. Finally, as a bit of a skew list, Knights are basically forced to put all of their points into vehicles, which could be great against some armies, but could also mean that they're absolutely screwed against others, if your opponent is packing enormous amounts of anti-tank. Overall though, I think that Games Workshop have done quite a good job of making Knights a bit more playable than some of the bottom tier armies. The objective secured handout was really nice. Next up we come to Chaos Demons, perhaps an army that I often struggle to rank in these tier rankings. Currently I feel that a lot of the strongest demon lists are just miles above the average list for the faction. Unless you're bringing allies, then I'd usually expect to see a fair few Keepers of Secrets with Be'lakor, plus a few of their stronger individual datasheets as support. Probably the biggest strength of the faction right now is their Exalted Greater Demon datasheets, and actually some of the great synergy that they can have with Death Guard or Chaos Space Marines, things like Epidemius really souping up Death Guard demon engines, or things like Heralds or Celeste helping out with Slaanesh keyword Chaos Space Marine Demon datasheets. Both of those synergies can get a lot of unintended power. However, I think for most casual lists, I'd probably be more likely to rate Chaos Demons down in Tier 4, alongside Guard and Chaos Space Marines. A whole ton of the datasheets in the Codex are really underwhelming, and they even handed out some hefty nerfs to some of the best ones, including Be'lakor and Nurglings in the latest chapter approved as well. They've got limited shooting, a fairly situational secondary objective, and no 9th edition Codex, which again seems to be the common theme of a lot of the weakest armies. Definitely a faction that's more of a challenge to play, though certainly some of their strongest builds can be a challenge to deal with. Next up we come to Space Marines, which have actually split across 2 different levels, just as I feel that quite a lot of the chapters really outpower some of the others. For Space Marines in general, I do feel that alongside Necrons, while both of them were initially really quite strong, Codex creep has gradually been taking effect, and now Marine lists really need to get the absolute optimum amount of their best books to be able to compete with some of the better 9th edition codexes. Space Marines have the advantage of a massive amount of data sheets to choose from, and then a massive amount of really well supported sub-factions to choose from too, meaning there's a lot of builds to flex to depending on what's dominant in the meta. I've got some nice solid core datasheets, including Vanguard Vets, Redemptor Dreadnoughts and Eradicators, and plenty more. Of course, with each chapter generally excelling with a few different datasheets that really exemplify their stratagems, chapter tactic and fighting style. I think Oaths of Moment is also worth mentioning for Space Marines. It's pretty handy to be able to pick up a fairly easy to achieve secondary, that even if you don't max it, you're very likely to score a fair few points. As for downsides though, as damage profiles have gradually creeped higher, there really are quite a lot of damage 2 weapons around, and the standard Space Marine stat line isn't exactly what it was at the start of the edition. A lot of their million datasheets really aren't all that impressive for the points cost, particularly not the non-core tanks, and arguably the best firepower in the Codex between Redemptor Dreadnoughts and Volkite Contemptors both saw nerfs in the recent chapter approved. As for chapter power though, I think it really does vary between the different books that they have access to. We'll get to the ones that are ranked in Tier 2 in a second, but here in Tier 3 I think that these are the ones who are struggling a bit more. Perhaps the 2 chapters that have seen the least success in 9th edition overall are Raven Guard and Imperial Fists. Raven Guard have a few fun tricks with deep striking Centurions, forward deploy movement and Banvet shenanigans, but people just don't really seem to be playing them very much compared with things like White Scars, perhaps more reliable mobility and charging. The Imperial Fists on the other hand are just incredibly limited. Most of the options in their book are just really bad. Their one saving grace is that they do bolters really well, but actually at the moment the best marine damage dealers aren't using bolters I think, so even that becomes a little bit underwhelming. Otherwise, a little bit stronger than those, I've also ranked Ultramarines, Salamanders and Blood Angels here. Ultramarines I definitely could have been persuaded to put in Tier 2. I think perhaps my favourite thing about the Ultramarines is their redeployment shenanigans pre-game with their stratagem, but they do have a few other nice assets such as Seal of Oath and Tigurius. Salamanders were doing great at the start of 9th, they've certainly got raw power, they're not exactly the best delivery options, and it seems for all-around raw strength people seem to be going to Iron Hands instead at the moment. And Blood Angels, despite being one of my favourite chapters, are just consistently performing very badly at events. Again, like the Imperial Fist, I just don't think that they have all that much going for them besides a really powerful chapter tactic. They certainly hit very hard in melee, but maybe just struggle to get there a bit more than some of the other chapters, and have really quite a lot of bad matchups in 9th I think. Hopefully the recent Death Company points drop will give them a small boost though. Moving on though, and we come to Tier 2. Here's where the armies are really starting to get quite good indeed. A honed list with a good player is going to be a struggle to get through. It's certainly possible to top tournaments with these, though I'd still say that they're a little bit behind some of the best armies in the entire game. First up, I thought we'd finish up with the other Space Marine chapters, these being the ones that I'd be more tempted to build around if I was building a cutthroat competitive Marine list. It seems that conventional wisdom on the internet appears to have Iron Hands as perhaps the strongest right now. As Space Marine chapters go, they really do have a whole load going for them. Mobility and extra firepower turn 1 with their Devastator doctrine, an untargetable dreadnought that can get all sorts of boosts to its firepower, are pretty much the best chapter to run with vehicles, do drop pod Devastators the best, can even have pretty decently fighty Vanguard veterans and things if you use Iron Hand successors, say with Born Heroes and Whirlwind of Rage. Overall just very solid indeed, certainly one of the stronger chapters. Otherwise we've got Space Wolves, another one of the strongest chapters in terms of enormously destructive melee, maybe with a few more helpful options than the Blood Angels, such as the Armour of Rust for easy fights last, and quite nice Rune Priest benefits including cover and -1 to hit. Wolfguard of all stripes are very destructive and dangerous, and the Wolfen and the Thunderwolf Cavalry both went down in cost maybe we'll see a few more of those in action as well. The Dark Angels are certainly another one of the strongest Space Marine armies. Mass Deathwing Terminators are a right pain to deal with for quite a lot of factions. Only wounding them on 4s plus the potential for a 2+ save with +1 from a Storm Shield just means they're likely to tank a whole load of incoming fire. Stomping those up onto an objective is really nice, maybe boosted with a little bit of fast moving, hard hitting firepower from the Raven Wing with 5+ invuls due to Jink. As well as that, the other sections of their codex just generally tend to be all round strong, warlord traits to manipulate doctrines, a stratagem that breaks horde melee, and psychic powers to mess with Obsec or give you a casual reroll all hits and wounds in combat. The Death Watch I'd say perhaps aren't quite so broadly reaching. They do seem to be one of the best armies to go to for making Dreadnought castles though, certainly until the recent toning down of Volkite Contemptors and Redemptors, just stacking 6 of those options alongside a Tech Marine and a Captain, and he couldn't really go too far wrong as you hoover up a lot of the enemy force. That build's certainly going to be weaker after the recent nerfs, but might still be strong enough to see play. But it's not like that's all they can do. Obsec kill teams with decent combat power and their interesting Army of Renown for massive damage. Both are pretty cool assets to have in a Space Marine army. Black Templars got a massive buff with their latest codex, generally a few big fighting melee squads, backed up by a few guns, and getting 5+ invul saves across the whole army with one of their vows. Certainly seems like it's a solid start to an army. Then hopefully some awesome buffing characters can take the squads to the next level. Helbrecht is great for his cost, as is Grimoldus or any other chaplains with litanies and maybe Tannhauser's bones. Finally, White Scars are another brutal, fast, hard-hitting melee army. They seem like by far the easiest way to deliver Space Marines into combat, working great with things like Vanguard Veterans or Blade Guard, and Kosaro Khan is an absolute beast for the points as well. Perhaps one of their strongest assets is their +1 damage combat doctrine on the charge. Certainly makes things like Blade Guard and Lightning Claws into things that can really shred vehicles provided they don't have -1 damage. Overall, I'd say that all of these armies do have the potential to win events as Space Marines, but it's a lot harder than it was at the start of the edition when Marines were running rampant. They feel like a far more balanced army than they were. Next up we come to Orks, who I think until the recent chapter approved changes I probably would have ranked top tier rather than tier 2, but I do feel that the points changes have probably been enough to take them down a peg. Perhaps the conventional wisdom with Orks lists were often going for either freebooters with massive damage buffs to shooting, getting a +1 to hit with all of their units potentially, or maybe building around Goths for melee damage, or maybe even Death Skulls for a lot of Obsec shenanigans. It seems that in the latest chapter approved, the freebooters build has taken a bit of a nerf. Some of their best buggies have gone up in points a bit, as have a few other key units that are just good for the Orks generally, things like Kill Rigs, Commandos, and the Beast Boss on the Squigosaur. Despite all this though, I think that Orks are far from being a weak faction. They're reasonably fast as an army, can still put together a shooty enough army list, and pretty much every unit is at least passably good in melee, and that certainly doesn't hurt. I do feel that with all the successive waves of nerfs between the balanced data slate and the multiple decent points bumps in chapter approved, Orks aren't going to be quite on the level that they were, but certainly look like they can put together some very solid builds, either shooting or melee. Next up we come to the Sorcerers and Rubricae of the Thousand Suns, generally fielded in their strongest list, in large formations of Rubric Marines and Terminators, backed up by a hefty cabal of Sorcerers, spewing out the mortal wounds, damage buffs and durability boosts. The Thousand Suns datasheets are kind of okay in themselves, they are durable Obsec units, but their whole playstyle is basically around making those units perform far better than they should do, and have further ways to amp up the army either via the Cult of Time to resurrect dead models, or duplicity teleporting units around the board. For an army that on paper doesn't have the most amount of killing power ever, they certainly can punish you hard if you get the forces too close to theirs, and they're able to unleash some optimal Inferno bolter shots. They definitely are an army with issues in counters though. Being so heavily reliant on Psykers is good, but it's also a bit of a curse. All the which can lead to some fairly easy secondary points. Armies that deny Psychic well, like Grey Knights and Sisters, could put a spanner in the works. They're relatively slow moving on the board when they're not using their teleporting shenanigans, and they might struggle a little bit for long-range firepower, particularly with the recent nerf to Volkite Contemptor Dreadnoughts. Still though, a very solid army with a lot of clever plays that they can make, all built around a very tough core of objective-secured models to hold down those primaries. Moving on, we have the Necrons, who I think I certainly would have been rating down in a tier below this if Games Workshop hadn't given them quite as many buffs recently. A whole bunch of their units gained core that didn't have it before, and in chapter approved, a fair few of their stronger options actually gained points cuts. Scorpec Destroyers, Flayed Ones and Locust Heavy Destroyers are all looking fairly fearsome for the cost now. Otherwise, they still have their blocks of warriors and flayed ones for reanimation tricks. The recent core buffs have allowed a lot more work out of overlords for my will be done, plus the potential for the Technomancer to heal some very valuable models like destroyers, and there's a few different ways that you can build the Necron armies, either the tried and tested combo of objective secured and pre-game move, Novok for mass melee, or maybe even Mefrit for more shooty builds. I still feel that it might be a faction that's just about getting into the strong armies rather than being right at the top of them though. They still do have plenty of weaker and underwhelming datasheets throughout the codex. I feel that while the Catan have some very nice rules, they are a little bit expensive for what they do. They don't have much psychic defense, and a lot of their HQ stat lines are a bit underwhelming compared with their competitors, but I'm genuinely going to be interested to see what people come up with new Necron armies, particularly utilising units like Flayed Ones or Scorpex. Next we come to the Sisters of Battle, another army that, like the Death Guard, took some fairly hefty nerfs on key units from the new chapter approved. Morven Vaal, Celestian Sacrosancts, Dominions and Retributors all took hits, though I think that their faction remains pretty strong as a whole. Getting those miracle dice for some reliable charges or very high damage results when you need them are great. The Sacred Rites mechanic allows you a little bit of flexibility, either giving you melee boosts or better deny the witch. A lot of the stronger Sisters armies make good use of shenanigans with those Celestian Sacrosancts to protect key characters such as Vaal or Celestine, and they still have an absolute ton of very solid damage dealing units, Sisters Repentia, Retributors, the Engines of Redemption, Zephyrim, and plenty more. Still though, I think they are a little bit behind some of the more top tier factions. Those nerfs certainly sting a bit, as do losing mixed sub-factions, say taking Bloody Rose as a patrol for all the melee units, and then something else for the rest of the shooter units in the force. Still though, the melter and combat damage that they can mete out can be absolutely brutal, definitely not a force to be underestimated. Finally for Tier 2 we come to the Admech, again probably an army I'd rate somewhere towards the bottom of Tier 2 as opposed to the top, despite their recent success with Mr. Siegler using them to win the LVO. As I'm sure most people remember, when the codex first dropped, it was truly murderously powerful to the extent it was really quite oppressive, but the faction has sustained several rounds of nerfs since then. Now I'd argue that while the buffs that they can be given really are quite good, the majority of the codex's datasheets aren't enormously outstanding, at least not compared with what they were previously. Plenty of units still have very decent firepower for the cost, particularly Rangers, but it's just the sheer level of things that you can stack onto these squads that really makes it worth it. Mars Rangers, for example, could get Doctriner Imperatives, Skitarii Marshal rerolls, Tech Priest buffs, Canticles of the Omnissiah, and the Forge World Dogmas. Being able to stack relics and warlord traits even within squads is handy as well. And for a different, more specific flavour of army, you can also use the Veteran cohort as well, trading more expensive troops for some better stratagems and options. I'd say that now, due to all these overlapping buffs and not really having quite as much raw power, they're a bit more of a high skill army to play, still hovering somewhere around mid tier and clearly can be used to win massive events as Mr. Siegler proved, but not just an army that you can line up and shoot the other person off the table anymore. Finally we get into the really good stuff, and these are the armies that I'd currently rank as the strongest in 40k right now. In top tier I've chosen to rank the Grey Knights, Tau Empire, Genestealer Cults, Adeptus Custodes, Drukhari, and Tyranids. First up we have the Grey Knights. They've certainly been a staple at the top placings of tournaments over the past few months, particularly Mass Dread Knight and Interceptor lists, two ridiculously solid units that move quite quickly around the board and deal good damage in all phases. The Dread Knights in particular do the heavy lifting, seriously good firepower and melee on a very tough and fast chassis. They have the potential to absolutely drown the foe in mortal wounds, have really good psychic defense with their 5+ save against mortal wounds and bonus to deny, and even apart from being able to move around the board quick enough with those two units, they can also use things like Gate of Infinity or Teleport Shunt to have another way to jump their units around the board. I will be interested to see whether or not Grey Knights really do retain their top spot though. The Dread Knights and the Grandmaster Dread Knights both went up by 10 points, not exactly a large nerf but will certainly take the shine off them. Interceptors went up a couple of points, making them a bit more of a luxury pick against the Strike Marines, and you also can't spam multiple Brotherhoods now, meaning that you've got a maximum of 4 Dread Knights and only 1 Grandmaster one. I feel like those changes are going to significantly weaken Grey Knight lists. Maybe there'll be more of an emphasis on Strike Marines now over Interceptors. I think it remains to be seen whether they're still going to be quite as dominant. Next up, I've chosen to rank the Tau Empire here. Their codex has only been out for a couple of weeks at time of recording, and at the moment I think we're yet to see whether or not they can really take events consistently or not. At the moment, and just with the theory of what they can do with their codex, I do feel that they're looking very, very strong indeed. They've got the potential for some absolutely monstrous firepower, and they should be able to do it fairly quickly on the move with Montcar, which also gives them a damage buff up close. I think crisis suits and broadsides with a core keyword are going to be ones to watch, particularly the broadsides in my opinion. And I think a lot of people are rather fearful of the big hitters, the Hammerhead and the Storm Surge, both of which certainly have the potential to end battle tanks in a single shot. I think maybe more of the question for the Tau though is whether or not they can consistently score objectives and hold the midfield while they're killing the enemy. Devilfish and Breachers and perhaps Kroot will likely help, but I still think that they're likely to need to be intelligently played, as just going full on Turtle Gunline doesn't really work in 9th edition very well. Being so reliant on the shooting phase does have its weaknesses as well. They're going to lack much psychic defense, and they've got very limited melee options besides that fun commander build that I talked about, Farsight and Kroot. Still though, I'm sure that the Tau are going to be hitting the boards in force. It's going to be fun finding out exactly what they can do. Next up, and another fairly recent entry, I've chosen to include the Genestealer Cults here. I must admit though, I was kind of borderline whether to put them top tier or be a bit more conservative and put them tier 2. Again, just with their new codex, they definitely have a lot going for them. 8-inch or 6-inch deep strikes truly are terrifying and will make boards feel a lot more claustrophobic. Plus there's some nice shenanigans that you can do with blip markers, and I've kept a lot of their slightly game-breaking deployment options with their proficient planning. Twisted Helix maybe looks like it's emerging as the way that most people are going to play the army. You can make a super murderous Patriarch with that, plus it's pretty great on their pure strain Genestealers, putting them up to strength 5, though they do have the potential to be somewhat shooty as well, with Crossfire giving them some crazy +1 to hit, wound, and ignores cover. Again, as they've been in the past, I think it still looks like they're going to be a complex or punishing army. If you do manage to make a big mistake, then it could be the game over. And if you don't manage to make good use of their damage buffs, a lot of the stats on their raw datasheets aren't exactly stellar. In particular, most of their shooting really is quite bad unless you can activate Crossfire. Still though, I'm sure a lot of people are going to be experimenting with them, and I'll be interested to see what they come up with. Next up, and the new codex that I certainly think belongs in tier 1, are the Adeptus Custodes, an army that I must admit a lot of people were lamenting when they got their new codex, mainly because they perhaps didn't receive all that big changes compared with the previous one, and lost a couple of neat tricks such as getting 3+ invul saves on their troops. Despite this though, when people have actually been playing the army, they do seem to be putting in a pretty storming performance at events. Second place at the LVO did go to a Custodes player. To be honest though, the Adeptus Custodes really weren't doing all that badly before, and the new decks did add martial guitars plus the new chapter tactics that they get, plus actually significantly improving a bunch of datasheets, particularly Trajan Valoris and arguably the bikers as well, even if they did lose objective secured. The Emperor's Chosen does in particular seem to be quite a good shield company, giving 4+ saves against mortal wounds, which are everywhere in 9th, as well as getting a bit of flexibility to switch out the shield company traits. The Custodes are a very decent 4-12 roster to draw on, lots of decent firepower units and strong dreadnoughts, and Games Workshop's almost day 1 patch for the Custodes actually dropped them in points quite a bit, the Terminators, Bikes and Trajan Valoris all going down, despite I think all of them being fairly decent already. They're certainly not an army without their weaknesses, they are very, very elite. Every model that you lose is going to be a big deal, and they certainly did get some of their options toned down, but it seems that when the army is taken as a whole, it's still very strong indeed, and is only going to be getting stronger now those chapter approved points are out. Next we have the codex that's very comfortable indeed in the top spot, in Drukhari. Games Workshop gave them their chapter approved points adjustments early, which did heftily rein in quite a lot of their most commonly played units, but also gave some decent points buffs to things like Grotesques, Talos, and other Covens units, meaning that now that the go-to list appears to be the Thick City build, with loads of Rax, Talos, Kronos, and Grotesques, usually with the -1 damage custom trait. Beyond that, they can pick and choose the other aspects of the Drukhari army that they'd like to include. The Succubus is still great for her points, even if she has gone up a bit, as are Archons, Drazar, Helions, the Court of the Archon, and their fire support units such as the Ravager. A lot of armies are just really going to struggle to chew through Talos when they're buffed by a Homunculus. Good invul saves, good saves, I feel no pain and -1 damage, just means that a lot of the firepower is just going to get wasted. On top of that, I think they'll still play well into the new missions. Cheap objective secured 5-man troop squads are pretty easy to come by, and racks seem pretty ideal for racking up those objective points. In general, I certainly feel that they're one of the strongest armies in 40k right now, though I must admit I think there's a fair chance of those Homunculi units getting nerfed again. I think they were kind of fine where they were before the points update. I really wouldn't be surprised to see Grotesques and Talos go back to the points cost that they were before. I still think they're arguably weaker than in their heyday where they had the really cheap raiders and the really cheap units to throw out of them, Raider spam, witches and incubi were all hit by points nerfs, though as the Drukhari have been able to pivot to covens, it's perhaps not so much of a big deal. Finally, last but by no means least, we have Tyranids. Currently I'd argue that they're a top tier army, and now Games Workshop has announced that their codex is on the way, which I feel is very unlikely to actually weaken them as a faction, even if a few of their powerful stratagems are likely to go away. Currently it seems that the most competitive Tyranid build is that Army of Renown that they got in White Dwarf, the Crusher Stampede that makes their monster mash go on steroids, handing out a casual free 5+ invul save and -1 damage, as well as a bunch of incredibly powerful stratagems. Between that and the recent Codex Leviathan supplement, Tyranids are one of the armies that I think have received enough support to overcome the weaknesses of an 8th edition codex. They really do have quite a lot of options at their disposal, Hiveguard ignoring line of sight and getting buffed up to the maximum, Genestealers and Termagant bombs if you're not going for the Crusher Stampede, and a bunch of synaptic link abilities that take the leader bugs to the next level. The Swarmlord's double movement is a near enough auto-include as well, pretty much guaranteeing first turn charges or better positioning if you need it. I'd say perhaps the downside to Tyranids are that they're kind of railroaded into the choices granted by their supplements. High Fleet Leviathan is just so much better than the other high fleets it's not even funny. Crusher Stampede seems really worth it if you're using any great number of monsters, and a lot of the other datasheets in the codex are kind of redundant right now. The Crusher Stampede did also take a small hit in chapter approved as well. The fast moving Dimacaron got a points bump, though I think they're still left with plenty of very decent options, things like the Hydra Jewels and all the codex monsters. Overall, I'd be surprised if Tyranids don't remain here. Even if they do get a bunch of their insanely good stratagems reined in, they're going to be gaining a bunch of extra things from the codex, which are likely to still be playable with both the Leviathan and Crusher Stampede formations, and it seems very hard to imagine how Tyranids could come out behind after all that. So anyway, I think that just about brings us to the end of our tier list of 40k armies right now. To be honest, while there are quite a lot of armies still waiting for their codexes, I don't think that the game is actually in too bad a place in terms of competitive armies that can win games. Things are certainly a bit more diverse than the Drukhari, Admech or Go Home meta that existed for quite a bit of last year. Quite a few armies that are fairly terrifying and vying for the top spot, and a fair few that could punch up and challenge them. Fingers crossed Games Workshop manages to keep some sort of semblance of this balance going as they roll out the future codexes. As always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Do you agree with the list, or did I rank anything too high or too low? Always happy to hear some feedback. Feel free to subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more like this. I do generally try and keep 40k videos coming pretty much every day. And finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.